Hi, everyone, and we're back for another episode of Wedgie Talk. Here we have another panel with some of my favorite writers and some of the most talented creators in the community to talk about the most important topic there is when you're a writer and when you're a creator. That's characters. How do you make them? What makes a good character? What characters stand out? And really, what goes into making some of the most well-known and favorite characters in the community? My guest today, I have the very well-known writer JCCW, my good friend ChaosReacon, and writer and fellow contest host, The Unwashed Marxist. And joining us, we have a very special guest, talented writer and artist Story 12. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Max, always the first to jump in, which is great. So as I said, characters, it's such an important thing. I mentioned to all of you before, in arghtime survey he did a couple years back, he asked people what the most important thing was in Wedgie stories. And surprisingly, for me, the answer wasn't wedgies, it wasn't humiliation, embarrassment, it wasn't story, it wasn't setting, it was character. That was the most important thing for everyone reading stories. The character had to be compelling, the character had to be interesting, or the story just wasn't good. So you've all made a lot of different characters over the years. Some of you have been doing this for quite a while with a lot of stories. Some of you, like Chaos, have been writing some of the same characters for a long time and really building on them. So I'd love to just sort of start from the very beginning when it comes to characters and writing, and talk about what your process looks like when you're starting a new story and you're making a character, what sort of goes into that, what you're thinking, and how you sort of make someone out of nothing. Chaos, what about you? As I said, you've written some characters you've had and been writing about for many years now. So what's your process like when it comes to writing them?
For me, it might be a little bit more difficult to answer where, sadly, I haven't been making new content as of late other than most of the contest stories. But to at least to put into focus of what the process is like, I will use my last story as an example where if anyone who has read that story, the main focus is just on actually one of my D&D characters. Just this character that has the perception of, I want to be lovable, I like whatever's cute, but I'm not gonna back down when things do get bad. But again, that's a D&D character, and so that's someone who I would like to play. In a writing sense, I will just use the bar owner as the example, where when it comes to that, it's what kind of influence do I want to pick from? If anyone's familiar with Full Metal Alchemist, that's kind of the idea that shaped of what's the general appearance that I want that person to be. Then next being, what kind of relationship do I want them to have with whoever they're communicating with? Are they gonna be the hard, tough as nails, or are they a business person and want to maintain a good working relationship with future patrons and such? So that's, for the most part, that's how I usually do my structure of what's the general look, and then what's the kind of relationship I want them to have in the world.
Interesting. So it sounds like you're drawing from a lot at the same time in terms of there's fandoms you're familiar with to model the looks of, it sounds like, while also trying to think first off what their place in the world is going to be, which is interesting for sure. For you, The Unwashed Marxist, I know you've gotten rid of a lot of your stories recently. Part of me wonders if anything with that had to do with the characters. But before we dive into that too much, what's your process like when it comes to making new characters?
Well, I basically have a two-step process for making a character. I'll try and be quick here, but there's some important stuff I want to cover, including a neat tip for the audience at the end. A character is made because there is a role that needs filled in your story. The first step in the process is the easy part, which is where I figure out what I want them to look like. That's pretty hard to fuck up, so I'll move on to step two. Step two is giving them substance so they aren't just an empty body. When I sit down to write a new character for the first time, I already have a rough idea of what they're like. I don't outline it all, and I just take what's in my head and I start going. Eventually, the characters start to write themselves on their own once I get comfortable writing them. After I'm warmed up or used to them, you could say, when it comes to that. It might be a little strange to imagine that, but, everything starts to fall into place once you get used to writing dialogue, actions, what are they like, what do they do, what are their backgrounds, and for the audience out there, use fictional characters and real life people as inspiration if you're drawing blanks on that. That's how all characters are made. It'll normally come to you pretty naturally, but if it doesn't, go watch some of your favorite films, talk to some interesting people in the real world. And, one thing that I think really jumpstarts personality development is this exercise that I like to do. Before I sit down and write start the real deal on a project, I open up a doc and toss some of my new characters in there. And you can write about anything and put them in any situation that you want. But an effective one that I find is you can write a hypothetical where your characters come to live with you for a week, and they'll follow you around and you can go on some adventures. Now, whatever you and your characters end up doing, the goal of this exercise is that by the end of it, the characters are going to be more defined, and you'll be better at writing them out of the gate when you actually start your big project since you've spent some time with them. So that way you can get that awkward exploration stage out of the way without sacrificing time on the real project to figure out your characters. And I think your project's going to be a lot better. That's what I like to implement when I'm making my characters.
Those are some great insights right off the top. Thank you for that. It sounds, again, making sure their purpose is fleshed out and finding different ways to be comfortable with them as you're writing, which is really great. Well, JCCW, you're coming in a little staticky there.
Gosh dang it.
Kamikaze!
Now we can hear you. If you're there now, I'd love to sort of turn it over to you when it comes to making characters. You've been doing it for a while now with Hana and Sarah, making new characters that we've yet to see. And you've made a lot of other characters throughout your story. So what's your process like when it comes to making new ones?
Okay, first of all, I apologize to the audience. My microphone is really screwing up. It was working earlier, but now for some reason it's not. I'm going to be working about it throughout this thing, but sorry for the staticky noise for now. What I like to start out with characters is giving them traits. I have lists, I have pages written down about just traits about a character that I thought would be real interesting to add to them, because giving a character traits influences how they're going to act within the story. So if a person, say, their favorite food is sushi or something like that, if a character asks them out, the first thing they could say is, how about a sushi bar? Or something like that. And that can completely change the story depending on what traits you feel like giving the character. I think sort of the way I can liken to this is the Star Wars prequels. In Episode 1, Obi-Wan Kenobi had no character traits whatsoever, and therefore he was incredibly boring. In Episode 2, you actually found out that he really hates flying, and that influences a lot of the movie. It explains why he's not why Anakin is a better starfighter pilot than he is, just because, well, he just doesn't like it. And that's what I think adds to great characters, is when you can find out these small little things about them that just adds so much to how they act, what their personality is like, and it just enhances the story in every way.
That's well said, and you made a good point there right off the top about their traits being able to also drive the story forward. In the case of the sushi bar, it's not just the fact they like sushi, but that this like can also move the story to a new place, which is interesting. And pretty key, I think, if you're able to do it. And sorry, great to have you on here and to join us. You've written a ton of different stories and made a lot of different art for your characters, including stories like Jessica's Day After and your Speed Queen series, where you often also create art for your characters as well. So I'd love to hear from you. What's your process like when it comes to making a new character?
Thank you. It's good to be here. When I make a character, the first thing I do is I think of a concept that I want to mold them around. Like, for example, with Phoebe, the first thing I thought was, what if I made a character who got superpowers because of the situation she got into? She got into these shenanigans. Boom, Blackpool gets struck by lightning. Now she has super speed. And from there, the next thing I do is I try and figure out a name for them. It just helps me if I can think of what their name is before I start getting into all the other details. And then for me, it's really important to give them a personality. I tend to keep my characters more open-ended so that I have more room to manipulate how they act in a scene. But for the most part, like with Phoebe, I made her like a really spunky person who kind of has a big mouth, talks herself into trouble a lot. And with that, I could always give her a good situation to get into. So mine's really short. That's pretty much what I
No,
do.
that's good. And for that, I'd love to sort of dive into what you mean when you say you like to leave them more open-ended. What does that look like for you? Is that not nailing down their personality with a few different traits, or what do you mean when you say more open-ended?
Well, I guess when I leave them more open-ended, it's kind of like I'll give them like a baseline personality, like, oh, okay, Phoebe's spunky, Esperanza's kind of snarky, and then I guess for me it feels like even though I do that, it kind of makes them feel flat sometimes. But I like to leave them open-ended because I feel like I can just develop their character more over time. Because I've been planning out chapters in the future where all the sorts of stuff happens. And I feel like with that, I can really alter their personalities to fit into a more defined structure later on.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense for sure. So one thing I'm curious about too, just as I hear about all of your processes and how you make characters, Max mentioned it's good to draw on real life people you meet, but I'm curious how much of your characters is you, I guess, to put it that way. Like how much when you're writing characters are you drawing on your own personality for them, or do you try to make them the exact opposite of you, or is there a little bit of you in all your characters? Was that, I guess, JCCW, I'm curious, is there a part of your characters that you go, oh yeah, that's me, or if they have this trait that's like me?
First, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, good. I think I figured it out. But yes, I think there is a little bit of me in every one of my characters. And I think it's just because I draw upon what I like about these characters. What I like, and that just sort of goes into these characters. Like, if I had to give an example, the characters that I drew, like, from my real life so much were the main trio for college days. I put my actual real-world love of theater into Callahan, my sort of desire to get friends and, like, be loved around people, into Maddie, and for my sort of out there, like, sort of like too abrasive when I get too out there sort of nature into Emily. So I 100% agree that like putting yourself into characters can definitely create some very memorable people, and I think this is just something every artist just does naturally, whether or not they intend to do it or not.
That's a good point for sure. And sorry for you, I'm sure I would hope you've never been sort of pulled up a flagpole and struck by lightning. So when it comes to some of the characters you're making, like Phoebe, who you mentioned, or Daria, where do you sort of see the line of like your own personality and them, or is that always a very separate thing when it comes to making characters?
With me, I would say that a lot of my characters are nothing like me. Like, I'm a very introverted person, and Phoebe's like a very extroverted person, and then Daria, she's more just like this really bubbly, kind of girly kind of girl. I'd say that the one character I made who's actually similar to me is Isabel from this like 6,000 word story I wrote. I'm gonna butcher it. It's in Italian, but it's like Fascio di Catone, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, she's like this really kind of like laid back. She's kind of like withdrawn as a person. Like she doesn't really reach out to people unless people reach out to her in a way. And I'd say that I drew a lot on my personality when I was designing her.
Definitely, I can see that for sure, and it's interesting, like you said, to have some characters that you write that are so different, and then some that are very much drawn on your own personality, which I think is fascinating. And Chaos, for you, again, sort of in the same way, you have these very fantastical characters with powers, often doing pretty incredible things. Does any of that come from your own personality, or do you really just look for the more outlandish ideas to put into them, to put it that way?
For me, anyways, I would definitely go towards some characters I drew inspiration from myself or how I wish I was. But in the same end, sure, some of the characters will have little tiny bits and pieces of me of what's something I would find interesting in them, blah, 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 blah. But in the same vein, you don't want to make every character something of you unless it's a very specific literary device that you want to do of all these characters. Let's just say, for example, psychologically, all these characters are kind of linked to me in such a way. Not saying that's how my series is written, but that's just what someone could do. In the case of, for the stories that I've written, there's a few here and there, but for the good majority, that's not the case. It's whatever fits the character or the clash of characteristics is something to also look at when designing what your cast should look like.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. And I think in your work in particular, Chaos, there's some characters who seems to have that almost psychological link where there's like Joshi, for example, and in ChaosReacon, the character's mind, and it is, I think, a big part of it's looking at who you want to be maybe as a person and what these characters can sort of bring out when they're connected to you, when that other personality can sort of be different and you get to live that out, which is interesting. So that's some good points. And Max, for you, how does that work? Is it a lot of your own personality and characters?
I would say that first and foremost, I probably give my characters a lot of my quirks, not necessarily personality traits. Like, for example, they like Westerns, they like old TV, Chiefs football, and in this one story on the Renegade Bronco account, the kid's a bowler. I'm a 225 average league bowler. The one character I think I've made, you know, he was still real different from me, but he was me in a way, was the David character in the old story that I took down. And basically, you know, the narration going on inside my head is much different than how I talk. I talk like a dumb hick, but his dialogue in those stories reflect the internal dialogue that I generally have going as I make my way through life. And you'll see, because I think a question's coming later on down the line, why I made him like me. But, I mean, I think that's pretty much all there is to say on that on my part.
Sure. No, it makes sense. So that's very, very insightful stuff, and I appreciate you guys sort of diving into that, which is great. So to step back, I'd love to hear what you think makes a character compelling. What are the most important things a character needs to really engage you and maybe your audience as well, do you think? I guess, Chaos, will throw it back to you. What makes a character compelling?
That is ultimately subjective to each person. But in terms for something I find compelling is, well, what are their relationships? How do they view the world? Do they view it in a very critical manner? Do they like to look things in parables? Or are they carefree and decide to show the world in a different kind of lens? It is ultimately just showing that they're more than just the 2D archetype of whatever someone may try to put them as to what would they end up being like in the real world. And sure, just taking the small little snippets of what you would post into a story of what would actually be most interesting.
Sure, makes sense. And sorry, for you, what makes characters compelling?
I would say for me, what makes a character compelling is basically their person. It's a lot about their personality. Like, I tend to like characters who are really boisterous and outgoing and like can say whatever they want, dance like no one's watching. Those are characters who kind of look I enjoy the most. And also, I really enjoy characters who have like a quirk of some kind. Like their quirk doesn't have to be super wacky, like, oh, I have super speed. But if it's something simple like, oh, this character, maybe they enjoy doing something so much that they'll drop like everything that they're doing just to go do that thing. Like maybe like Phoebe's in a situation where she doesn't want to do something, and then Esperanza's simply like, oh, I'll go and buy your favorite ice cream, and she'll be like, okay, I'll do what you want. Something like that.
Cute. I like it. Yeah, those quirks, like we mentioned, seem to be a big aspect. Having those unique personality traits that help them stand out is a very cool insight for sure. And JCCW, what about you? What do you look for in characters to make them compelling?
Interactions. That can be my short answer, but interactions are everything to a character. You can have a character with the deepest, darkest, most complex backstory, and if they do not talk to somebody and interact with them, your character goes nowhere. I think that interactions, being able to put a character into a scenario where they're able to communicate with others, that is something everybody loves to see. It's sort of like, if I could compare it to anything, like the game Journey, where it's not so much about what the story is, it's more how you interact with the entire world around you, how you yourself just sort of view events happening. That's what readers like to see, is just stuff happening, events happening, interactions happening. And that's what makes good character, is how they can bounce off of people, how they just work around a person. If someone's personality conflicts with theirs, then they aren't going to like that person, and that's what we like to see.
I like that. Interesting. So for you, it really comes down to how characters sort of butt heads or come together in stories, which is interesting. And we see that in a lot of your work. So it makes sense to hear how that translates to what you're looking for in characters. And Max, what about you when it comes to compelling characters? What are you looking for when you're making them?
All right, now there are too many character types here to get too intensive, so I'll try and keep it pretty broad. My basic philosophy on making compelling characters is this. You have to stuff them full of quirks so that they're one of a kind. You have to make them look unique, and you have to make them act human, for better or worse. Above all else, you have to make them interesting so that people love them and want to keep reading whatever you're writing. A good rule to keep no matter what you're writing is that a character needs to either pass for a real person or they need to do a damn good job of pretending to be one. The number one thing that you want to avoid are paper-thin and empty characters with no personality. How many times your character usually gets punked down every day, what fucking underwear they wear, or who they're in bed with, that's not character depth and it's not character building. You need to make your readers, and you need to convince me that your character could realistically jump off of the page and pass for a normal person if they really had to. That's how the best and most memorable characters are built in, I guess, a broad sense, I would think.
I like that. Definitely, I think some really great insights across the board there, which is awesome. A lot from making sure they have those quirks to making sure they interact with people in ways so you can bring out that personality is great as well. We covered a lot there, but if you all had to sort of distill it down, I'd love to hear if you could sum up what one of your 1 to 3 most important things a character needs. And it can be quirks, or even if it's just something like when you're reading about a character, what do you need them to have? Do you need to have like their underwear described in a story or things like that? Or is that just a key detail for you? So when it comes to reading a story or writing one, and you're sort of making a new character or writing one who's existing, what are the couple 1 to 2 or 3 most important things a character really needs, do you think? JCCW, I guess we'll start with you on this one. What do you think?
I mean, I would actually, well, for me, the way I write is I would disagree with what Max has to say and say that the person's underwear color could potentially say something about their character. That's exactly what I do, is that I've looked up, I think I have a tab actually saved of a website where it's just the meaning of colors. And every time I get to a part of the story where I have to describe like a person's clothing or a person's underwear, I go onto that and I look at the meaning and I'm like, what color just fits the mood of this story most? Like, what fits like the personality of this character the most? And that's sort of what I go off of when it comes to sort of just smaller little quirks about a character, is that I try and hide little like colors in there to sort of add some meaning into the scene.
Okay. So from there, to sort of dive into that a bit more, underwear color being something that could potentially, or even design being something that potentially could drive character development in depth. Is that one of the most important things for you? And what are some other important things that you make sure you always have when it comes to characters? Or is that number one, the biggest thing for you, is what does the underwear look like?
I think that would theoretically have to be the most important considering the community we're in. But on a personal level, that would probably just be I'd say the most like important thing to structure, like to character structure, is the scenario they're put in, because like I said, interaction is probably the most important thing a character could ever do. So if they don't have a good scenario to like be structured in, or to like be put into this structure, you don't really get anywhere. So I'd probably say have a good, I don't want to say story, probably plot would probably be the word I'd go for. Have a good plot and use everything you've built with this character and make them interact with this plot, because that's what makes compelling character to me. And of course, make sure their underwear color fits in with everything going on.
Yeah, I guess if it didn't fit, I'm not sure what that would look like, but I could imagine if but I guess that's the joke, right? Maybe even if they're super tough goth like Luna or something from Between Two Cheeks story, and then she's wearing like frilly pink white granny panties or something, right? That's the joke. But
can you imagine a nerd wearing a lace black thong?
True, but that sounds great to me. I want to know why she's wearing it, or what the deal is there. Maybe it's like she's the hot sister and the nerd is her other sister, and they like switched the personalities for a day or something. See, look at these great story ideas we're coming up with. Now I'm gonna have to steal that. But before I do, yeah, exactly. Or in a few days, who knows? We'll see. But But yeah, I love that. So, Chaos, for you, what do you, if you had to drum it down and sort of break it down, what are the most important, one, two, or three most important things a character needs to have, whether you're reading them or writing them?
Personally, in my case, what will make them the most interesting? A little bit difficult just because there are a few different ways to go about making characters. But I guess let's do it as this kind of exercise. What character of mine would you want to know? Like, what would be the most important things that went into making them?
So I guess we'll go with Joshi, who's been in a lot of your stories more recently, and you mentioned the Black Rogue earlier on. I guess with her, what were the most important details you needed to have to make her interesting?
With her, it was definitely personality first and foremost, where it's a character that at the very beginning of the idea is how they woke up into the world initially and trying to actually find themselves. I haven't written that part of her yet, where ideas are definitely flowing around as to kind of how the character initially interacts with the world being in the state that she was. But biggest thing, again, personality. With the type of power that she has, she is very cocky, but in a very fun way of she likes to have fun, but she won't be a pushover, and she will let you know of when you done fucked up.
Okay.
As for other aspects, this is definitely where I'll be in the middle of the road between what Max and what Marxist said and JCCW is that it's an in between where same idea, like I'm definitely of the mind of underwear definitely is something that kind of tells a little bit of the individual. I guess more so for girls than for some guys. Some of them really want to be flamboyant down there, but especially with the saying of one's lingerie choices is another side of you if they're going to be comfortable about it. So, say example, like when discussing about the total clash of opposites, let's just say a biker chick who would wear short shorts is wearing full back panties that day. Like, that just clashes against the outfit. Sure, it might be something that they want to wear when they're lounging around and that kind of stuff. But in this case, you want something that fits the character. So in the case of Joshi, it's lace trimmed, something that kind of brings out more of a cute aspect to her, whether that be black, pink with polka dots, or just something in that ballpark.
Okay, so makes sense. So it definitely sounds like underwear could be a faucet to explore personality, but not the only one, like you said. It goes a lot deeper than that. And for Sorry, what about you? If you had to break it down when you're writing any of your characters, what are the most important things for you?
Well, for me, the most important things when I'm writing one of my characters, probably one is what their quirk is, and two is their personality and how it interacts with other people's personalities. So, like, I enjoy characters who clash and butt heads a lot, but also characters who like to get along. Like, Phoebe has her bully Lana, who basically they're always clashing because Phoebe doesn't like her and she doesn't like Phoebe. They're always insulting each other. Phoebe knows she can't beat her, but she'll still insult her simply because she just wants to spite her. And as far as clothing goes, for me, I don't generally decide based off of their personality. Well, I kind of decide on the based off their personality, but for the most part, I just think of something that I think would be a fun look for them, and like kind of just slap it on there.
Interesting. And that's something, especially because you're an artist as well, that's something I think we'll revisit when it comes to crafting their look as well. But Max, I'd love for you to hop in here. There's been a lot of sort of discussion about the role of underwear in developing a character, what its place is, if it can add depth to them or anything. For you, it sounds like it's not just about it isn't that it cannot develop them, but that just saying the thong wearing woman isn't enough to have a fully drawn character, right?
Oh, hell no, it ain't. Now, that's one really specific thing, but I wanted to talk about 3 things that I think are important. You know, I have a little list here. They're more broad. So first of all, a character needs to stay in character, and that is the number 1 priority. If they break character, then it's going to ruin your story, and it's going to drag the reader away from whatever they're reading. It makes them shake their heads and go, well, what the fuck, writer? So if you have a horrible dictator character that likes to burn villages and rape women, he better have a really good reason for saving the orphanage. You see what I'm saying? Now, secondly, a character needs to have flaws, however small they may be. Nobody wants to read about a world full of goody-goody types. It's just not realistic, and it's bad entertainment. Who wants to read about that? No one.
Sounds like a dystopian fiction to me, which could be interesting. No creativity, no evil. Sign me up.
Well, and my last point is that every character in your story needs to want something. This could be a big goal, like if you have a guy who wants to fight for his country and become a hero, or it could be a simple wish, such as to if he wants to live happily on the farm. No matter who you ask in this world, everybody wants something. In our characters and in the real world, it is the fact that they want something that drives the plot and makes the story. Your bully wants to kick the piss out of Jane for laughs. Jane's mom, Mary, wants to keep the bakery open. And the twisted guy called Ron, running for Senate in Iowa, wants money, power, and to strip his ex-wife, that's Mary, of everything that she has become because he's a rotten and vindictive bastard. So everybody in your story has to want something, and that's what makes a good narrative. And that's an essential part of building a cast of characters.
That's great. And I joked about not wanting to or being interesting in reading a story full of goody two-shoes, but you're right, without that conflict, without the realism of it, it definitely can hurt immersion unless you're trying to subvert the genre, for example, or do something that's really out there. So that's some really great insights for sure. So one thing I wanted to sort of dive into some of your works in particular, JCCW, like Hannah and Sarah, we've talked about a lot. I think it's come up in every panel we've done, and when we spoke and whenever we talk, it's been in the works for a while. You mentioned to me and some others that writing the characters in a consistent way, especially because you've been crafting the story for so long, has been a bit of a challenge for you, and it can be tough to really know who they are in some ways. I think that's fair to say. So I'd love to sort of dive into what have been some of the challenges of writing their characters, and why has it been more difficult, it sounds like, than some of your other stories to craft them?
The hardest part so far has been the ending of like the whole story. And most people would hear that and be like, wait, you're already like working on what the ending is going to be when the first part isn't even out. And that is an important part of writing a story, is making sure you know what the ending is going to be before you even start working on the first episode. But so far the ending has been the hardest part because none of the characters felt complete. Like, the original story was going to be that one of the characters was going to feel really bad about something they did, and then the other character would feel bad about what they did, and then they'd have to kiss and make up, and that's just so boring, and it really didn't like give anything in terms of character, and not only that, it felt like it sort of conflicted with one of their personality types. So what I did is I completely revamped what these characters were going to be and made them into something way better. And what I did with that is I planned for a much shorter Hana and Sarah story, and then it just started growing and growing more recently as I realized, wait a minute, I can add in a bunch of just fun little scenes that show off like how these characters interact with each other, what these characters react to, how they react to certain events going on, and that is what's making my new ending just a whole lot better for me. Because now it feels more complete. It feels more in tune with the characters, and man, I love these characters. Once I finish the whole series, these may be my new favorite characters.
That sounds great. To have that is always very special for sure. One thing I'm curious about too, just the idea that from a character perspective, you're able to craft the ending before you sort of dug into a lot of the other parts. And I totally understand knowing the ending before you start writing other parts of it or before you've written the entire story. But for you, it sounds to me, I'm not sure about the others here, but to me, it sounds like it'd be kind of tricky to, especially from a character perspective, to sort of want to start. It sounds like writing the ending first, because you haven't yet seen the characters progress or go through the story. But for with your process, is that sort of how you're doing it? Are you actually writing the ending down first, or are you just sort of thinking about it and outlining where it has to go first?
So does everybody? So for everybody, we'll think back to your high school English days, and they would show you that diagram where it's like the beginning, the rising action, the falling action, the climax, that sort of thing. I actually have a page in my notebook. I have a small little notebook that I like to write in. I have a small notebook, like a small page in there, where I wrote out each individual part of the story, and I have notes along all those parts that say, "Here's what the character is going to do here. Um, here's how they transition into this part of their character. Here's how it relates." And that is sort of how I planned out the ending. Of course, I didn't exactly plan out the ending first. I went through it, made sure the ending just made sense after everything, and then I went back and I tweaked a few things to fit in with the new ending. And yeah, I think this really shows transition of character like way way better, so that I don't actually lose it when I'm going through the actual writing style, which that's another very important thing. Never lose what the character originally is, because character flanderization is one of the worst things you could ever do for a story.
Yeah, it's tricky, especially when we get to questions of, but what if a character is changing throughout? Don't they lose who they originally were in some ways too? And maybe should they? But maybe it sounds like you're talking about degrees of, you want them to be some parts the same by the time it ends, so they're still recognizable, even if there are some shifts. Is that sort of a good way to put it?
Yeah, that'd be a good way to put it. Small little
Yeah.
character shifts throughout the story. They're just like, they're not like blatantly obvious. It's like, here's how the character is changing, but it's just noticeable enough to where when you're reading it, you're like, oh, that's real nice.
Nice. And for Chaos, for you, I'm curious. You've been writing some of the same characters for a long time, like in Chitoro's Alchemy Trials, very long-running series, and now Joshi sounds like you have plans to keep writing her. For you, what are some of the challenges and benefits of writing characters for so long and in such ongoing stories?
Well, luckily for me, if I recall correctly, I said this in a previous podcast, but it was very much of a spin-off off of the official idea that I had for my characters, where it being more centered on God's divine and kind of where their beginnings began and where the ending would eventually take place. I wish I had a better answer for this, but at this point, it's just simply just finding the time just to sit down and just actually write the damn thing.
Sure,
But
from a
in this,
character perspective, when it comes to you've been writing them for so long, does it make it easier to know who they are, and you're never sort of worried about messing up the character personality, or does it get tough after a while? Have you ever gotten bored of the characters and be like, oh man, I've been writing so much of these characters and I'm tired, time to start something new? Do you ever feel like that when you're writing something like Chitoro's Alchemy Trials?
at this point, no. It's how to word this properly. More so of it isn't really the challenge. It's just more of finding the idea of when's the next time I get to explore this character, and not exactly in the challenging way of, oh, what can I do? It's more of when will I get to it? Is, I guess, the more of the challenge of it.
Okay, and I guess it's tough when you have a lot of ideas in your head, as you probably do it sometimes, and not all as much time to write as you'd like. I guess can be tricky to know what has to come first, what you're able to write, making sure you keep all the ideas in your mind for characters. I guess a lot of the struggles I imagine you're facing with a ongoing story like Chitoro's Alchemy Trials, for example.
Oh, the cutting room floor is pretty bloody.
Well said. And let me think. For you, as we mentioned, you're also an artist as well who's made a lot of art for your own characters. So I'm curious, when it comes to making art for the characters, do you start with what they look like in your head? Do you see them before you start writing them down, or do you start writing stories and then a vision of them comes? What's that sort of look like for you? Sorry, this is for Sorry, Chaos. You're also an artist, so I'm curious about your thought on this too. But Sorry, who has done a lot of art for Daria and the Speed Queen and some of the other characters, what's that process like for you?
Oh man, let's see. So for Daria, I was following my big concept, so I was like, okay, I want to have an who's just like incredibly powerful, but then at the same time she doesn't want to use her power on Earth because she feels like she's taking the cheap way out. So I went with that concept, and I was thinking, okay, how can I make her look human, but at the same time look like slightly off from a regular human? So like I gave her white hair, like yellow eyes with blue slits. And it's always really hard to see, but her eyes kind of glow a little bit. And she has fangs in her mouth and everything. So for me, I kind of designed her around that. While for her sister Katerina, the funny thing was I basically designed her around the whole tomboy outback thing. I was like, no, Daria needs like a tomboy, and then I just went with that and gave her like shorter, spikier hair, gave her like more like sagging clothes. She like cares about her appearance, where if you call her out, she's gonna get upset. Like she'll still do it because she thinks it looks cool. So I'd say that's what I put into like designing characters.
Yeah, it makes sense. It sounds like feeding in their personality into the art you do is very important there for sure. And has it ever been tricky when you're sort of turning them into art or sort of writing stories about them to make sure who they are stays consistent throughout stories?
Yeah, because with them, I only wrote one story with Daria in it, and other than that, I've been using her a lot in RPs. So I've been trying to solidify what her character really is. And so I've been trying to make her someone who's just really curious about everything that has to do with Earth, or just like she wants to know, why do humans do this? Why do humans do that? And I've been trying to, like, one thing I gave her was I gave her a quirk where she's really bad at cooking because she's like never cooked before. She never had to eat before. So like I had this one thing where she's trying to cook bacon for the first time and she gets splattered by the hot oil and she thinks the bacon is still alive. So she like raises her hand and she's about to blast the pan with eldritch fire before someone stops her and they're like, you can't do that. You're gonna like, blow up the whole kitchen.
So it sounds like, yeah, quirks being super key, those smaller details really help build it in. And it's interesting, like you said, when a lot of the way you explore the characters through art, having to then bounce that in stories and make sure that character that people are connecting with sort of stays true to this idea of her that maybe in some ways, because in your art she's doing so many different things, could always be changing maybe who she is and what she's doing, which is very interesting. I guess because I haven't chatted with you a ton about your work, sorry, I'd love to just sort of take a second to talk about what some of your favorite work is that you've done from a character perspective, and really to step back and sort of talk about why you started creating work and if it had anything to do with making characters.
Let's see. So I started creating work. It's been years now, man. But basically, yeah. I like joined the community. I think it was like 7, 8 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I was just like a complete lurker. Didn't even favorite things at first. I'd just look at people's profiles and read their stories, look at their art. And then at one point, I was like, you know what? I should start contributing like my own stuff to the community. And then from there, it kind of just grew and grew. I started trying out different things and bringing in new characters. And with my works, I'd say my favorite one right now is the fascist story I wrote. That one was I had a lot of the Smithsonian Channel on, and they had all sorts of documentaries about like Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And then I was like, you know what? What if I wrote a story and with a fascist society just centered around this one ideal, and they just enforce it upon all their citizens? And so that one was, I thought it was really fun to write.
I love that when you can find those fun ideas. And I guess for you, is there a favorite character that you've made now since entering the community and crafting all these stories?
Let's see. I'd say my favorite characters are Phoebe and Daria. Phoebe, because I've written a couple of chapters for Speed Queen, and I just love the way she acts and interacts with everyone around her. And Daria, she's fun to draw, but I also hate drawing her because her hair always takes me for, because I got confused. So drawing all the curves is very frustrating, but it's also really rewarding at the same time.
That's great. I love that. And Max, for you, we mentioned it briefly. You mentioned deleting a bunch of your stories, and the other day I was looking at your account and noticed there was so few there. I'd love to sort of ask why that is, and did it have anything to do with the characters in the stories? If something about them just was rubbing you the wrong way?
No, the characters weren't the problem. I was. The prose was amateurish and hackish at best, and it wasn't my best work. It was really, really shitty writing all around when I went back through and read some of it. And it's not a reflection on my true ability as a writer, and it was a sore thumb that was sticking out on my main profile there, and it just had to go. I might remaster some of the stories one day and re-release them, but as they stood, they had no business being on any profile of mine.
It's interesting because it's in the time I've known you, it seems like you have very high standards for yourself, and also that can also come out as being very optimistic and sort of positive about your own talent, which is interesting as well. I guess have you seen yourself sort of grow recently to sort of look back at your older stories and think this isn't up to par, or is that just something that sort of comes to you every once in a while where you just have a sort of change about what quality looks like?
Well, the main reason for all of that is that I have improved exponentially. Like, I couldn't even tell you how much I've improved since I came back in November. Like, the difference between my work back then, like, it was passable. If I saw it and I was a reader on DeviantArt, I'd be like, yeah, cool. But I feel like my ability right now is I don't think there's a writer on this planet who is my equal. I am very confident in myself, and if you don't think that you're the best, then you have no business writing. You should think that you have the potential to be the best to ever do it, and so should everybody on this panel, and so should everybody listening. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to push yourself to perform at your best. But have fun
That's well
too.
said. That's well said. Yeah, and it's rare to hear someone speak so openly about their own talent like that, which is very interesting. And I'd love to sort of hear you mention sort of growing exponentially since November. What sort of helped you grow so much? What have you done to sort of improve your writing in that time?
Yeah, it was the easiest thing that any writer can do, and you have to do this if you want to get better at writing. Is you have to read a lot. Like, for instance, this time last year I wasn't reading much, but I'm pounding through maybe a book a week at least. And you have to find writers that you admire, writers that you want to aspire to. You want to go out there and you want to read their stuff, learn what you can from them, but you need to say, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to do it better than that bastard ever dreamed of doing it. And so that's really the secret. You have to read. That's it.
Read, and then confidence, it sounds like, too, to want to do it and to believe you're good enough to do it really well. Sounds like something to keep you going. And I imagine too, I don't know how much of this you've seen, but for any of the writers here who had negative feedback come in, or even just when you get to those periods, if you've ever had this where you're sort of down on yourself and thinking maybe your work's not good or it's not worth writing, maybe having that confidence can be a big boost as well, which could be interesting.
Well, when you get negative feedback of any kind, yeah, it's going to feel shitty, but you have to take that feedback and retool it and learn your lesson and go back through and do it right the next time, or at least nail it in when you're doing practice runs, when you're doing little experiments and stuff like that. Because if you just sit down and quit, then there's no way to overcome that. You have to. I like to use anger and frustration and sticking it to somebody as my motivation. Like, for instance, if I wrote something and I showed it to everybody on this panel and you guys ripped it apart, my motivation for getting better is, I'd sit down at my desk and I'm going to be like, I'm going to show them the best shit they've ever seen. You have to have that fucking attitude and you have to believe in yourself.
Nice. I love that. That's great. And I'm sure we could have a whole panel just on the importance of that, but I think it's a really great point. And I'm sure we can come back to that at the end. But one thing I'm curious about, we've talked a lot about characters, what makes them compelling. So for everybody here, I'd love to hear the favorite characters you've made or read about in stories and what you liked about them. I guess, sorry for you. Who are your favorite characters, either in stories you've read in the community or that you've made yourself?
Well, for me, I already said that my favorite characters are Phoebe and Daria. Those are my characters I love the most. In the community, I did like Abigail from YWNR. I just liked how she grew as a character, because for me, I sometimes struggle with developing characters past their states unless I write a bunch of things about them. But reading reading a longer story and just seeing how someone changes because of how they interact with people and how people impact their life, it looked really something I really like to see.
I love that. That's great, and thank you for the kind words. I know we've talked a fair bit in the past, and also our mutual friend EHP32 has only amazing things to say about you and your great RP abilities. So I'm surprised we haven't started writing something together. Abigail meets Phoebe. What adventures do they have? Kind of story. But thank you for that.
Mhm.
And JCCW, for you, we've talked a lot about your characters, and I think it came up a bit here as well. But who are your favorite characters you made and also read in different stories?
My two favorite characters that I have written so far are Callista and Quint, otherwise known as the Nerd and the Onlooker. I they're just so adorable. I love these two so much. The one interaction that they have with each other in three perspectives at the very end of each of their stories is just I just love it so much. I catch myself at night just going into my Google Docs on my phone and just typing like a madman just a quick like short little story about these two just either on a date or heck I've written their first kiss. It's they're so adorable. I just love how these two play off of each other. I love like just like they're both extremely different from each other, like hobby wise, even sort of personality wise, but they just feel that strong connection of just to be wanting to both protect and be protected and support. Like there's just so much like I just love everything about these two. And there's a little bit of bias there considering that Bloom's illustration is just so damn good. But
Oh,
my favorite character that one of my favorite characters that I've read about is one that I gain a lot of inspiration from. Another praise towards Hans Gutherson. I love Claire Jackson so much. The one of the female teachers from Teacher Wedgie Fight. I absolutely I base so many of my like deep thinking fetishist thought like from her. I base a lot of my like how those characters act based off her. She she pretty much like I say this a lot that if it wasn't for Teacher Wedgie Fight, I probably wouldn't be a writer.
wow.
Like I like anytime I've actually revealed my fetish to real life friends, and I've showed them like what I do because I've actually done that. I actually show them what story got me into this thing in the first place, and what I show them is Teacher Wedgie Fight.
Wow. Heavy stuff. You're gonna bring a tear to my eye, my dude. Don't tell me stuff like that. Thanks. That means a lot. That really does mean a lot. But yeah, Claire's an interesting character, and one I model a lot after myself, and that was one of my very early stories. So that really means a lot. And thank you very much for that. But you've definitely grown beyond her, I think, in a way. She was more uh, simple, kind of some of the scenes and dialogue. It was sort of, I don't know how realistic some of it was. And I see the work you do with characters, and it's steps and steps above with how real and how much detail you put into their interactions and characters. And I know in your recent story with the therapist, that was just miles above with the dialogue and how realistic the characters was. So I definitely see you growing and taking these characters that you like and sort of evolving, which is always fantastic to see. So that's really awesome. For Chaos, before I start crying, what are the favorite characters you've made? Because you have quite a few, and also ones you've read in other stories.
Well, some of that definitely ties in with one and another, but in terms of uniquely my characters, uh, Joshi and Chatoru are definitely one of the bigger, prouder moments. Uh, and definitely with being able to finally write Nova into my stories was definitely a big joy, just to be able to show her bubbly personality to my worlds was definitely a big positive. In terms of others that were definitely my favorites and kind of leads into some of the characters I've created was Val the Vampire. That was made by Puppy Dog many years ago.
Yes.
Which could be an inspiration to Sasane, but if I'm right, I had the idea for her before then, but it just helps cement like kind of that kind of attitude of being very promiscuous in a fun way, and damn the consequences as long as everything turns out all right in the end.
I love it. And I think consequences is something I've been fascinated by, how writers in W stories maybe don't like consequences or like to avoid them, or how we often don't really see them in stories too much, which is interesting. But yeah, Val is a character I remember well from the old Lucky Fish forum days, of having some magical powers and being this character who, although a vampire and although kind of magical and out there, still had some elements that were familiar in terms of her fetish and the way she interacted with people. So that's a very cool example to hear. That was an inspiration for your own work in some ways. And Max, what about you? Favorite characters you've made and ones you've read about in other stories?
I would say that my favorite characters out of the stuff I've written for the website are two that appear in a story called A Funny Story on Hospital Hill, which, if you haven't read that story, it's about a terminally ill artist who takes commissions on DeviantArt as a sort of side gig, and he's been in this hospital room on the top floor for a few months, and he's been coughing up blood and falling down and all that. And one of the nurses has the hots for him, and she comes in one night, and she brings him some dinner from McDonald's, and he's laying in his bed with his drawing tablet working on his first commission for this particular community. And you can go ahead and read the story if you think that sounds interesting. But I like those characters, and I feel like they're some of the most genuine and true to life that I've made for the website. Yeah, the smutty part was a bit sketchy in terms of execution on my part, but they were really fun to write, and I think they really fit the oddball meta sort of idea that I had.
That's fascinating. And I think we've seen some of that nutty, more meta stuff in some of your other work, which is interesting. If that's been a style you've been interested in exploring, like in your more recent series you started. But with that, are there some characters and stories that you really like or have sort of been inspired by in some ways?
Well, all right, so hear me out on this one, because I think I'm about to show you why character development is so important, and this message is going to be a little bit weird, but you'll get the point. All right, so if I'm being 100% honest with everybody here and in the audience, my favorite stories in this community to read are the Danganronpa fanfics on DeviantArt, and it's not really even close. I like Anya and I like Spiral Kata. Now, these stories are generally stuffed with torture porn from start to finish, and they feature little to no plot that would be taken seriously outside of a handful of pasty circle jerk accounts like me that read them. They are nothing but fan servicey romps, but they have a dirty little secret that makes them really potent and addictive. Now, I love these stories, but I really honestly don't like stories with similar content to the fanfics where the authors use their own original characters. I just don't dig them. So why is it that I like the Danganronpa stuff and not the original characters, even if the content has that same kind of energy? Well, the Danganronpa characters have something that the most popular OC universes in the community don't. Every character in those Danganronpa fanfics adds up to hours and hours of screen time in games and anime where they're being tossed into dangerous situations and they're fighting for their lives, and as well as, minute after minute showing them in an environment where it's not supposed to be porn, and they act like semi-rational people, and they talk to each other, and, it reveals their individuality. When I read a fanfic that the character Nanami is in, I see the same Nanami that is in the game and on the anime. Nanami is Nanami no matter who writes her. So Smut Nami, when Angie makes a Smut Nami, she has all the backstory and traits that the real one does in the eyes of me, the reader. The other fanfics with Yosis, they don't have all that anime and all that game time that I've seen to back it up. So basically, these fanfic writers are carjacking what the Danganronpa franchise, the people who made it, they're hijacking that character development and they're tossing them into a fanfic story about a bunch of porn that I like. And if I didn't have all of that background, I wouldn't enjoy them. That's the difference. The content is is absolutely the same, but the character development couldn't be any more different, even if the characters are flat in the porn.
It makes sense, yeah, when you have this existing narrative, especially in a video game where you are in control of a narrative and you spend so many hours seeing a character develop and getting used to them and becoming attached to them. It can definitely be tricky, I'd imagine, in a story where you only have so many words, a couple thousand, to create that attachment in the same way, for sure, for original characters. So that makes a lot of sense, definitely. And from that, we're almost through all my questions, but I'd love to quickly talk about if there's a least favorite character you have of your own for whatever reason, if you feel like there's more you could have done with them looking back, or just someone who you feel like all your characters are strong, but this one's just for some reason a little below the others. And this can be least favorite in your own stories, or if there's for some reason a character from another story that you felt could have been stronger or just rubbed you the wrong way. I'd love to sort of dive into that. Chaos, what do you think? Do you have a least favorite character or characters?
This was always going to be a difficult decision, and I'm probably going to have to still be difficult with it, that I really can't think of anything from anything I've written.
Okay. Yeah, it certainly can be tricky to sort of look at your own characters or others if there's ones if you just like all work or find something good in all of them. That can be tough, but I'll give you a chance later on if you can think of one of your own characters you think maybe there's more I can do there with them. But JCCW, for you, do you have a character who you feel could be stronger or just isn't your favorite of the bunch? Stories you've read or also outside of that as well that you've written or read about?
For me, my least favorite characters that I have written are Megan and Jake Stormart, Ellie's parents. And the reason why is, despite the fact that I have put these two in some real whack scenarios, especially Megan in Valentine's Day story, I just really haven't given these two any real good moments, let alone any good traits. Like, I still do not know, like, freaking anything about Jake, and I've written the dude. I've written the dude, and I barely know anything about him. Megan, I can sort of get away with knowing more about her because of my 4th of July story, but really, I just have not written enough about these two to really, like, give them any sort of interest. So I'd probably say they're my least favorite characters that I have written about. I may change that one day, give them a little bit more personality, give them some more, like, fun character traits to interact with. But until then, I mean, we can just have, well, I'll just stick with Megan giving birth in an atomic wedgie.
Still one of the craziest scenes in a story ever, hands down, period. But you make an interesting point that for writers maybe not feeling their characters or thinking they don't know enough about them, the solution to that could just be writing more stories with them. And Max gave the exercises there of just putting them in stories, even if they're not wedgie related. Just sort of acting out different scenes with them and finding out more about them that way as a way to grow some fondness for them, which is interesting as well. And for Sori, what about you? Do you have a least favorite that you've written about or any in stories that you've read that you think could have been stronger?
Well, for me, I would say I have two characters who I dislike the most from my stories. The first is Lana, and it's for a similar reason to JCCW. Just basically, I haven't written enough about her to get a good grasp on her character besides being an antagonist to Phoebe. And then I think I might have mentioned that she likes Speed Queen, but other than that, I just can't figure out for the life of me what I want to do with her. And it still bugs me to this day. And the second character I would say is Maria from my fascism story. I like her clothing mandate, but the fact that she basically took over a nation's government and is forcing her ideals upon everyone in the nation and like established a secret police and like a paramilitary organization and everything just makes her like a really bad person at heart.
Yeah, and it must, I guess, can be definitely hard to love the villains. Sometimes they can be the most interesting characters, but definitely maybe not the ones you're rooting for. You'd want to be stuck in a world full of wedgies with. So yeah, totally get that. That makes sense. And Max, what about you? Do you have some least favorite characters you've written or read about in stories?
Well, I guess I should give everybody a cautionary message here. Sometimes characters can be a bit too human, and you can take too much from a specific person, and it gets kind of weird. You know, there was a character in one of my stories that I wrote last November that I tossed in that was really my high school sweetheart. And we've got a kind of weird relationship. You know, I'm schizoid, she's batshit in her own right. And so I tossed her in there. She wanted to be in something I had written at some point. And we reconnected, and you know, I got to talk to her. It was weird as fuck. It was like a lucid dream, a deja vu purgatory. You know, I felt like I was talking to one of my characters, and I just grew to dislike the character. And so now that the stories are gone, if any renditions come back, she will be replaced with somebody. I don't know. That's maybe just something super specific to me. Just be careful about how much somebody you put in there, because it might be kind of weird.
I like
I mean,
that.
I showed her the shit. She liked it, but
Wow, that's great. I'm sure, yeah, it can definitely be tricky. If, like in my case, I sometimes use writing to vent a lot, and I've done it in a story, including like someone who was very much modeled after my ex at the time in one story, and yeah, like I would never show her that story, but I could definitely see how just having that can be tricky, and bringing in a lot of those real elements can be something you gotta watch out for when you make them too real, in case it becomes just problematic in any ways for you looking back at the character, which is interesting. So that's a really cool insight. Well, I think that answers all my big questions. For all of you writers and you creators, is there anything about creating characters we haven't touched on, especially advice you might have for aspiring writers when it comes to character building specifically, since it's, as we've said, so important and something I think if writers want to write something, they got to be thinking about from the very beginning, it sounds like, and throughout the process. Uh, is there any advice you all have? I guess JCW, if you have some final thoughts or other things we haven't brought up. If not, would love your advice on just building characters for aspiring writers. Any advice you have writing characters in general for wedgie stories?
Start small. Write out really, really short stories. Like if we want to help out with that, we can create some more like 200-word stories, 500-word stories, real short stuff, and you just focus all of your attention on making sure you create a scenario that is just interesting enough to have your characters bounce off of that, be able to interact with all that stuff. And while you're doing so, just make sure you're including just as much differentiated like characteristics about each of your characters within everything. Just always make sure include traits, make sure they interact with the story,
and you'll be all good.
I like it. Great insights for sure. And sorry for you, like you said, you've been doing this for several years now. So for writers coming up, what advice do you have for them for writing, and specifically when it comes to characters? Anything you think they should keep in mind?
Well, for me, I think one thing you should keep in mind with characters is make sure that they're fun to write. Because in my opinion, there's no point in writing a story with characters if you don't have fun when you write the characters themselves. Like if you're trying to write a story where one girl is getting bullied and you're thinking to yourself, wow, I don't like this character, why am I even doing this? And I think it'd be best to go back and reevaluate the character that you created and try and make them into someone that you like more.
I like that. It's a good insight, and something we probably don't think about often enough when it comes to writing, is making sure, especially I imagine if they're in an ongoing series or like in your Speed Queen or in any of the series any of us have started, make sure there's someone you enjoy writing, because that's just going to make the process a whole lot easier and smoother to write. If it's difficult to write them, you're probably not going to want to keep doing it. So it's really great advice. Thank you for that. And Chaos, what about you when it comes to, we've talked a lot about advice you have for writers, but when it comes to specifically building characters for writers just starting out, trying to figure out how to even make a character in the first place and where to begin, what advice do you have for them?
Make sure it's something that you enjoy. Don't necessarily worry about, oh, I need to make the best depiction of this. No, just focus more on if it's something that you enjoyed. Because if you enjoy it, then nothing else matters. It's nice to get the feedback of from other people of what you could do better. But most importantly, do it because you want to. Because once you start writing something just to get it done, then some readers might find that within your writing of the writer just doesn't really enjoy said character compared to others, or maybe for the entire series in that fact. So most important, let it be good to you and you alone. Then consider what if other people may enjoy it.
Okay, always good advice, and tricky to follow for sure for many of us, myself included, I think, who are very focused on making sure it's something people like, but it really is very good advice, I think, to really just be focused first of all on if it's something you enjoy, because it's the old cliche, right? If you like it, presumably others will too, which is great. Max, for you, what advice do you have when it comes to building characters? We've had a lot of insights tossed out, but for writers just starting out who are looking at a blank page and thinking, I really want to write, but I don't know how to make a character, what advice do you have for them?
Well, my advice is, I think I said before, you have to read, you have to get out there and meet some real people, and you also have to take inspiration from, if you like TV, if you like anime, anything like that. Because when you think about it, any personality, even in a real person or a fictional person, can be traced back by, hell, even my personality has been affected by my parents and who I grew up with. A fictional character you might like might have been inspired by 3 other fictional characters and somebody's uncle slapped in. It's all a big mess. And, it's your job. Don't be afraid to take inspiration from people and to read and learn about that, because that's really all creating a character is. And once you sit down and you start writing that character, eventually you will warm up to that character and you will get used to writing them and they'll write themselves.
Nice. That's great insights across the board, guys. Thank you all for that. So I think that answers all my big questions. We talked a lot about character, your own characters and others, and what sort of stands out and how to write them well in Wedgie stories. Is there anything we haven't touched on in terms of the writing process when it comes to characters, or insights you wanted to toss out about writing characters, or just stories you think people should check out for good examples of how to write good characters?
I have some recommendations.
Please.
Yeah, if you look at the contests that I've ran, two of the most consistent authors in terms of putting out good stories, the goal of the contest was to, I'm wanting people to write complex characters and plots, and we got a lot of that. So the users LF Shadow Melder and Magnipoles have each pulled out. I don't even think any of their stories. I'm trying to think of a score. Yeah, they all scored pretty high. And some of the best character work I think I've ever seen come out of writers who write smut on DeviantArt, and that's not a knock. I mean, they were legitimately good stories, and the character work that they do in there is top notch.
Nice. That's good. And for the others, what do you guys think? Is there anything we haven't touched on in terms of character building and Wedgie stories, or just stories you think people should, or art writers, they should check out, you think, when it comes to building characters? And if you want to plug yourself, by all means.
It's a really simple, like, very obvious, big sort of property to try and say, go look at this to see how this happens. But honestly, Harry Potter is a phenomenal place to go to look at character and story, because when you read it, like, each character is so distinct to one another that each one of their characters, like, you hear their names and immediately everything about their character comes in. And when you reread the actual books, you see a bunch of small little details about how these characters have both physically and mentally, like, completely changed. For example, in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, you start noticing that Ron and Hermione, they're arguing a lot, and it sounds a lot more like a couple's argument than it does friends arguing. And, like, that's just small little character stuff that I think just adds so much. So I highly recommend Harry Potter. If you want to start out, like, how do I make good characters, you go there to see how you make good characters.
Nice. For Sorry and Chaos, what do you guys think? Any last thoughts or properties you think people should check out in the community or outside of it too, as JCCW mentioned?
Well, for me, there was this one story I read online. It was years ago, but it was called Psych Investigation Episodes. It's basically the story that takes place in the real world, but there's people who have like superpowers, and the fact that they have powers is hidden from the general population. And I just think that the way the author handled the characters was amazing, because every character had distinct personalities. They all had distinct motivations. So like you always knew this character is acting this way because not only is that because of their personality, but because it ties into what they as a character are looking for. And that was one of the things that actually inspired me to get deeper into writing.
Mm-hmm. Nice. That's great to have those titles that can do that for you. Is always really amazing. And that sounds like good. I know I'll be checking it out, so thank you for that. And Chaos, what about you? Any last thoughts about writing characters or titles to check out, either inside of the community or outside of it?
Well, I do finally have an answer for the least favorite, and it's not necessarily one that I made, but more so when I was with my ex close to a decade ago, when I was first making my Chatoro's Alchemy Trials. The only reason why I do bring this up is because she made a fanfic of my story, in which all that it really was self-insert for her just to sleep with the character that represented me. So do keep that in mind, especially when it comes to what others may find as as a least favorite character is when not necessarily the obvious self insert characters, but how they're even brought in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, it makes sense, and I'm sure we all have seen some of those stories in the community where you're reading and you imagine, like, I wonder how much of this really is the writer just putting themselves in the story. And in some cases, it works really well, and I can think of some examples of that. But sometimes, yeah, I could definitely see it just jarring to read in some cases, especially if you realize, like, this character is trying to sleep with the character who's supposed to be you. Is a very interesting dilemma to have, Chaos. So that's great. But I think that's great. A lot of great insights, guys, into writing characters and writing Wedgie stories. It's something that you all take very seriously, which I love. It's easy to look at the community and go, oh, it's just smut. It's just writing that you do to get off and get people off. And that's probably part of it. And I think an important part, but it's also a lot more than that. So I'm glad to hear you guys put so much passion and sort of detail and work into building the characters and building the worlds that you do. So I want to thank you all for that, and thank you all for taking some time to chat. If there's nothing else, I just want to thank everyone for listening. I hope you guys will go check out all the great writers I have here and their excellent stories. I hope I get to chat with you all some more. And sorry, I hope I can count on you for your own podcast episode in the future. This was great chatting with all of you. And I hope you all stay safe and take care in the days and weeks to come. So thanks for listening, everybody. Bye for now.